it doesn't mean that objects are simply an illusion. It just means that our reality is malleable. If we want to break it down to its minimum elements, it wouldn't be elements, it would be processes.
Wahida Khandker, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you've written a lot about the idea that reality is made of processes rather than things and objects. Can you tell us a little bit about what this means and why you think that this is the right view?
I guess it's not so much that I think it's right or that I need it to be right. I think of it as a useful and an interesting set of questions to help us deal with, I guess, a lot of our contemporary problems, such as the environment, how we treat other species. I mean, primarily those are sort of my areas of interest. And also from, a basic philosophical grounding, and for the purposes of teaching students and bringing students into this conversation, it's also a good set of questions for dealing with problems of what the nature of the mind is, what consciousness is, the role of embodied experience, and so on. So, it's not, as I said, it's not a question of belief. It's a question of, what is the most productive and helpful way into this set of problems.
So it's a sort of framework that creates an interesting conversations.
Yeah. And, framework, methodology, so that, I'm really interested in exploring those different ways to do philosophy. And, I think that, the different disciplines and also different aspects of human activity, such as the arts, for example, give us different ways of doing philosophy as well. And so process philosophy, I feel like, some of it is down to our personal interests. What appeals to you? What kind of framing of problems appeals to you? But I do think it has a particular applicability and openness to those other disciplines as well.
Right. So can we run with that then with, say, the environment or the philosophy of biology? How does thinking in terms of processes help there?
Okay, so in terms of the environment, if we talk about that, so I think the problem that I'm particularly interested in now, and I think it has informed a lot of my work up until this point, is that we just don't have good enough concepts to think about them. So, if you think about the situation we're in at the moment of environmental degradation, things are changing in terms of how we treat other species, but we have, a limited set of concepts and a limited understanding of other living beings. And so our responsibility, and I think it's a philosophical responsibility, is to renew the concepts that we use to help us think about the environment. So what if we stopped thinking about the environment in terms of a set or a finite set of natural resources that are there for our exploitation, and rather think, well, how do we as living beings relate to other species? What's the extent of our reliance on our environment? What can we do in terms of changing our behaviour? And this is a shared kind of set of goals with any environmentalist movement. So how can we change our behaviour grounded on changing our concepts to help us live in better ways, I guess. I didn't want to sound really cheesy then, but in better ways that help our environment rather than use it up or exploit it.
So can you give an example of a case where we're thinking in I guess, object terms about the environment and that's unhelpful, and that switching to a process way of thinking would help?
Okay, so if we talk about other species, for example, so we tend to operate with hierarchies. So we talk about, and I guess our biggest problem is we tend to think about human beings as at the pinnacle of some hierarchy of different living beings. And that, is based on a limited concept of the mind as if we've solved that problem. We know what the human mind is, or the human consciousness or human identity is, and that other species are somehow lacking.
So having the kind of mind that we have puts one at the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah, it's sort of observing our own behavior, and then observing other species and saying, well, they don't have our properties, they don't have our abilities. Therefore, this is a basis for creating a hierarchy and adhering to it. Whereas from a process perspective, there's no commitment to any of these divisions between us and other species. Is actually more interested in what our relation is. And if you think from a biological perspective, we are, I think it's commonly accepted, or I guess in, I was going to say it is controversial in some aspects, but there's a common uptake of evolutionary theory, for example. And to an extent, most of us accept that we are just one amongst many species, and we're all on the way to something else as well.
So is the idea that rather than thinking of us, ourselves and other animals as individuals, which we can place on some sort of hierarchy, we have some sort of deeper connection because we're all parts of some sort of the same process? Is that?
Well, it's rather than putting forward, we could say that we have a lot more in common with other species. It's the philosophical perspective that I come from, as I said, is not necessarily aiming at coming up with an all-encompassing ontology or way of thinking about the world or reality in one single way. But it's saying, well, whatever concepts we have, when we look at its history, what were the reasons for coming up with those categories or those hierarchies? And once you understand that there's a history and there's a set of decisions behind that, they no longer have the authority that you originally might have thought they did. And so it's about finding and being willing to explore new ways to relate to other species. It's saying it's not a done deal. So it's not, there isn't that comfort in certainty in doing this sort of work. And because we are so, I don't know what the word is, we're so embedded in a certain way of thinking that a lot of the philosophical work is about undoing those preconceptions, those presuppositions. So if you're in a place where you're questioning, what are we doing to the environment? What are we doing to other species? That's the first step, and we're not quite past that yet.
Okay, so one thing I've seen you do in your work is connect this process framework or process methodology, I suppose, to panpsychism. And you just talked about the importance of minds in this kind of hierarchical picture that we have. Is there a connection there between this idea of panpsychism and not thinking in terms of human minds at the top of this hierarchy?
Yeah, and panpsychism is one way of challenging, I guess, the superiority or the singularity of the human mind. It's saying that there is some form of experience that's distributed across other beings. And this was a central part of Bergson's work, for example. Panpsychism is one name for it. There are many different forms of it.
Can you say what some of those forms are? Can you talk about what some of those different panpsychisms are?
There are different ways of thinking. You might have quite a complex view of mind, and then attribute that to other species, or say that the universe is a kind of mind, and we are exemplifications of that. And it's not to disagree with those, but perhaps you don't need to go that far and just say, well, look, all other species have some degree of will, of activity, of a desire to continue, to preserve themselves. And so, well, if that's say that is our minimum unit, our minimum way of thinking about mind or consciousness. And so we can say that that's not just ours, that belongs to other species as well. And so that would be along the lines of panpsychism, but it's not, there wouldn't be a single commitment to a way, a definition of panpsychism in that sense.
And what's the connection between a process ontology and panpsychism?
I suppose it would be, rather than saying, if you're saying fundamentally, the one thing we can say about reality is that it is like mind, that it evolves over time, that it brings the past to bear on the present, and it might manifest in different individuals. You could say, well, as a process philosopher, perhaps that's a panpsychist view. That would be more in line with Whitehead's thought, for example. So I guess the minimum unit of reality that we could talk about in Whitehead is what he calls prehensions. And that gives us an idea that at the root of all, when we sort of reduce reality to its parts, or the nearest to its parts that we can imagine, we'll say, well, there's a kind of mind implied in that. But when you're doing that, as I said, it takes that privilege away from human beings. And it says, well, if I have mind or consciousness, it's because I am like the rest of the universe. I am part of it. I am an example of it. In that sense.
I see. So having a mind doesn't mark us out as different. It marks us out as part of everything else.
We're one amongst many.
And is the idea here that by thinking about consciousness itself seems to be a process, whereas when we just look at the world, it seems to be made of objects rather than processes. Maybe you might want to challenge that. But so then is the idea, if you give primacy to consciousness, that gives you more of a process metaphysics?
Okay, I suppose there are different steps towards that. So what I wouldn't agree with in that picture is that the world is clearly made of objects. And I think this is really Bergson's analysis, that when we see objects out there in the world and they seem to be fixed, what he's saying is that, well, we've done that, we've put that in the world. So I was looking to see if there's parlour books on the table there, and I can look at it and I can see that there's writing on the front of them, and I can discern that there's a pile of books on the table, and I could pick them up and start reading them. But if we had a cat in the room and they saw that pile of books, they might recognize that as a handy place to sit. There's a different set of rules, if you like, or a set of tendencies that make us see certain objects in the world. So no room or no space is just what it is. There are different possibilities that it can fulfill depending on who's observing it. So this goes back to the point earlier about if we changed our frame of reference, if we changed our concepts, we could look at the environment in a very different way. As I said, instead of seeing it as a set of resources for us to exploit, we might look at it differently as our home that's under threat and that, requires additional care, or that might be suitable for other species and so on. So the very idea that the world is just objects, or even, if we could look at the world properly, we'd have objectivity. That itself is a question, or it's in question from a process perspective. And so we need to change our categories.
Sure, but I suppose just from a very intuitive, naive perspective, it does seem like when you look at the world, it's made of objects, right? Or no, would you even push back against that?
But even then, I mean, that, I suppose, I can concede that most of the time we're not reflecting on the world around us, and we might take for granted that it's objects. But again, just that very I guess I don't want to say the basic exercise that you undertake when you engage in this kind of philosophy, is that you don't take for granted the world is just objects or made a certain way. We've constructed things a certain way. We've made spaces more hospitable for ourselves. We've made spaces more inhospitable for ourselves. So it's recognizing the range of our activities. And I don't necessarily think that requires a philosophical outlook. It's part of, different areas of, town development. You sort of demarcate spaces in very different ways for different purposes. So for anyone, any kind of professional, in town planning or building or architecture, no space is just a space, and no objects are just objects.
So there's a sense in which we're imposing objectitude on the world. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Yeah. Presumably there's a reason we do that. What's that reason? Like it's helpful for us to do that in some ways?
It's for use, it's utility. It helps us get around. It helps us navigate spaces. It helps us to build. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It helps us get about our day. It helps us to build communities. It helps us to, as I said, plan cities. But just on an everyday basis, just finding your way around. It's basic functions. So from a Bergsonian perspective, again, it's not a criticism. It's just saying, well, this is a tendency that we have because it is useful for our survival to do that.
And is Bergson saying, or are you saying that in some sense, the idea of processes, their processes are more real than the objects, or are processes themselves equally kind of our impositions on the world?
I suppose ultimately, all we can say, or what we can say, is that process is real, but it doesn't mean that objects are simply an illusion. It just means that our reality is malleable to a certain extent. So if we want to break it down to its minimum elements, it wouldn't be elements, it would be processes. And then we say on top of those processes, we build ourselves a relative stability. And actually, if you just think in very long, it doesn't have to even be geological terms, but none of this here will be here in, a few weeks' time, perhaps. And just in a very real sense, I think we can accept that, nothing is simply objective or it's simply permanent.
Sure. How though can we make sense of process and change itself without having a prior idea of objects, right? Because it might seem that you have to have objects which change. If there are no objects, then what is doing the changing, I suppose?
Yeah, and equally you could flip that around and say, well, you couldn't have a sense of permanence without understanding what change is. And could you not just have an object which just sits there, doesn't move, doesn't change? I suppose but even, with the help of physics or chemistry, we understand that doesn't happen, that all objects degrade over time eventually. And I think, it's one of those things. I don't need to be right on that because I couldn't ultimately prove one or the other. It's to choose a set of questions that help you think things more clearly, help you to solve problems that you couldn't before. But I think the understanding of process is something that's very fundamental to us. For example, this idea of consistency. So we are all consistent with our 10-year-old selves, and yet we're also fundamentally different. And that, I think we all do. Sometimes I still see the world in the same way that my 10-year-old self did. And yet I've got decades on top of that, and it helps me think differently. So we all understand that change is actually fundamental to who we are. And yet there's a kind of stability that gives us, a consistency, but it doesn't have to be rigidity and the inability to grow. So I don't think either of us would win that
Sure.
argument necessarily.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Well, if that's all we've got time for, but it's been a fascinating conversation, so thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me.